What is up, guys? It is your boy Steady Chaos. In today's video, I want to do an SDR picture settings video for the LG C1. A lot of you have been asking me for this for the last 2 or 3 months, and I am certainly willing to share. It's just I have not had a whole lot of time lately, but here we are. And keep in mind, picture settings videos, I say this in all of my picture setting videos, these are subjective, a lot of these settings. There are right and wrong for certain settings, but honestly, it's your TV. So if you want to give my settings a try, absolutely let me know in the comment section down below how you feel about them. And share your settings with me. I will try yours as well. But keep in mind, you may like some of my settings, you may not like it. Nothing personal. Picture settings are purely subjective. We get it. So first, we'll start off with the thing that everybody is probably aware of, but bears mentioning, is you hit the home button on your LG C1 remote, you go down to dashboard, go up to these 3 little bullets, hit edit, go to edit inputs. Now, whichever HDMI input you're using your source with, whether it's PC, Xbox Series X, or a PlayStation 5, go to that HDMI input. So I'm on HDMI input 1 with my PC and RTX 3080, put it in PC mode. So this will allow your LG C1 to properly display and render full chroma information, which is basically RGB or 444. If you don't put this in PC mode and you leave it just in, HDMI 1 mode, or you put it in, a lot of people will put it in game console mode, then by default the TV will render and display chroma subsampling 422. So what you want to do is make sure you put it in PC mode so the TV can effectively render chroma 444 or RGB, otherwise known as full color information. Most people know this, but again, it's worth repeating. Go back to HDMI input 1, which we have Halo Infinite on here. Now, again, we are doing SDR, so hold down the gear button on your remote, bring up the TV's picture settings. Let's start at support. We'll go to OLED care first to get these out of the way. Care picture settings off. Device self-care. We don't need to worry about, actually no, we do need to worry about this. Energy saving. Make sure that energy saving step is on off. Don't put it to maximum, because 3, 2, 1, and your screen it goes bye-bye. It goes really dim, especially in HDR. It'll kill your specular highlights. So just set it to off so that you're getting your screen's full performance and full brightness, okay? You don't want to compromise your screen's dynamic range, whether you're using SDR or HDR, so off. Back, OLED panel care. Screen move, just leave that to on. As the description says, the screen moves little by little at regular intervals. Prevent the screen from occurring problem when the TV is on for a long period of time. That is horrible English. I don't know, somebody who is Korean clearly wrote that. Basically, all it does is, if you have static displays, or if you're playing a game with a static HUD, like a first-person shooter, or you're playing a sports game with like a score box in the center of the TV, you play that game for hours and hours, days and days, weeks and weeks, and over time, those pixels, which are constantly that bright, vivid color, whatever it is on that HUD, they're being subjected to high levels of voltage, and they're decaying at uneven rates compared to the rest of the screen. So what screen move does is it takes some of those pixels, and you won't even realize as the user it's doing this. It'll move them a little bit to the left or right or up or down to try to spare some of those pixels from being subjected to the same high voltage and same high bright logo or a HUD over time. So I would definitely turn that to on. Now, adjust logo brightness or logo luminance adjustment on the C10. This one I would recommend setting to low. Now, certain outlets like ratings.com or rtings, depending on how you pronounce it, they said if you set it to high, it can adversely affect your screen's brightness, especially in HDR, so they recommend setting it to low. So if you notice here, if I set it to, let's take a look at the clouds up here. Grab my mouse here. Let's take a look at this bright scene right here. Let's set it to high. Now, let's see what happens when we set it to off. Will we notice any difference in screen brightness? In 3, 2, 1. I notice a little bit, but I don't think my camera's going to pick up on it. So suffice to say, it does manipulate the global brightness of your TV to a minor degree. And whether or not you set it to low or high kind of just depends on also how quickly it dims some of these static HUDs and logos on your screen. Low will provide you enough protection from image retention and burn-in, but will not really compromise any brightness of your screen. So just leave it at low. That would be my suggestion. Care recommendations is off. And then we go to general real quick. Devices again. TV management. Make sure that your TV is in home mode. You don't want it to be in store mode. Some people, if they buy an open box or they buy a display model, it could be in store mode, and that will mess up your colors. That will over brighten your image, oversaturate it. So make sure it's in home mode. And then we go down to HDMI settings. Make sure that your HDMI input that you're using is set to 4K, not off. So if you leave it at off and you're playing on an HDMI 2.1 source, which the LGC one is HDMI 2.1 compatible, which allows you to play 4K 120 with, Chroma 444, full color information as we talked about. If you set the HDMI deep color to off, you're not going to get that full chroma information. You're going to get some form of subsampling, 422 or 420, which means reduced color. You don't want that, right? So make sure that you have it set to 4K, which unlocks the full bandwidth potential of your HDMI input. So you get that full color information, or full chroma RGB 444. So 4K. Okay, that's done. Now we go up to picture. We are in game optimizer mode. That is critical. You do not want to use something like filmmaker mode or ISF expert, because then you're going to introduce all sorts of input lag. Game optimizer mode keeps the input lag as low as humanly possible. Aspect ratio 16:9, which is standard. That's normal. Leave that as it is. Advanced settings brightness. OLED pixel brightness, again, we are in SDR. If you're in HDR, then OLED pixel brightness and contrast should both be 100 to maximize your screen's dynamic range and light output. But we are in SDR, so it's a different story, right? Most SDR content is mastered at 100 nits. It's a far cry from Dolby Vision content in HDR 1000. So with OLED pixel brightness, a lot of people I've seen online, they recommend you have it up to 70, 80, and the default setting for game optimizer right out of the box is 90. That's way too bright. Way too bright. You're washing out the image. You're reducing your blacks, the saturation of your blacks and saturation of your colors. That's way too high. So I found over the last several months using this TV that 45 is the best setting for me. Visibility is still good, and the image retains some of that saturation and dynamic range, if you will, even in SDR mode. If you go too high, I feel like you really are washing out your image, and you're losing some of that colorful impact. So 45. If you find that's a little too dark for you, try 50, 55, see how that works for you. Adjust contrast, it's 85 default out of the box. I pump it up to a 90 a little bit, just to, again, increase the range of my SDR content just a little bit to increase the vibrancy of the television. If you go to 100, you could introduce a little bit of clipping in some of your brightest areas on the screen. Let's try going to 100. Yeah, similar to setting your pixel brightness all the way up to 80 or 90 and blowing out the screen, setting your contrast all the way up to 100. It creates a little bit of weird bloom around bright objects, and it clips in bright areas. So I would recommend between 85 and 90 is a good spot. I go with 90. Screen brightness 50 is default. I leave it at that. Auto dynamic contrast and peak brightness in game optimizer and PC modes is grayed out, because if you engage processes like, auto dynamic contrast, for example, you're adding picture processing to the TV, which means you're adding input lag and latency. You don't want that. Gamma, basically this adjusts the mid-level luminance of your television. You have a range to choose from, BT 1886, which is basically a fancy word for, or term for gamma 2.4. You can go 2.2 and 1.9. Similar to reducing your screen's brightness and having maybe better perceived contrast, but crushing your blacks a little bit, that's what 2.4 does for you. So you see 2.4 here, the screen get a little bit darker. The contrast may look a little bit better, but you may lose a little bit of visibility. So for gaming, I recommend 2.2. You see the screen brightens up just a little bit. You still retain most of your contrast. If you feel like your visibility is not good, you could go all the way up to 1.9, but it really does wash out your image, and it's not recommended. So I would say 2.2. Black level auto, just leave it at auto. The LG C1 or C10 for that matter will always correctly diagnose the black level being fed to it from a various source, whether it's your PC, your PS5, your Xbox Series X. And it can depend, because for the PlayStation 5, for example, it only has 32 gigabits of bandwidth. So if you end up playing in 4K 120 Hz with HDR, then the PlayStation 5 does not have enough bandwidth to render full RGB or Chroma 444. So what it does is it goes down to Chroma subsampling 422, which ends up giving you a limited black range by default when you use Chroma subsampling. So if you set this to full and then you play 4K 120 with a limited range on the PlayStation 5, your inputs are going to be mismatched. You always want to make sure your source is the same as your display. So limited is limited. So limited PlayStation 5, limited TV. Full PlayStation 5, full TV. If you mismatch your sources, that's when you get washout, that's when you get black crush. You don't want those things. So rather than worry about how much bandwidth you have, what the PlayStation 5 is outputting or not outputting, just leave it to auto. In the LG C1 and C10, in my experience, always choose the correct black level so you're never mismatched. And that does it. In motion eye care, just turn that off. Basically what it says here in the description, the screen brightness is automatically adjusted according to the motions in the video. You do not want the TV, or at least I don't anyway, manipulating my screen brightness, changing my picture settings. I set the TV the way I want it to look, and therefore I want it to stay that way. So motion eye care off. Color, 55 is the color depth default setting out of the box. I'd recommend you keep it at that. Play around with it. Again, this is kind of a subjective one. You could try going up to 60 to add a little bit more vibrancy. It doesn't change much. So play around with it, but 55 default seems to be pretty accurate for me. And when I ran AutoCal with CalMan calibration software, it recommended that I go somewhere between 50 and 55 for the best accuracy. So just leave it at 55. Tint, 0, color gamut. This is auto. This is what you want. Depending on the source, again, from your PlayStation 5, your PC, your Xbox Series X. If you're playing HDR content, then you could use a wide color gamut, which is DCI P3 BT 2020. If you're playing SDR content, then that would be Rec 709. That's a narrower color gamut. So the TV would correctly detect that it's a narrower color gamut, and it would put it in Rec 709. Conversely, you're playing in HDR, it would detect that it's DCI P3. It would put it in DCI P3. Much like your black level, just leave it at auto and the TV will be just fine. Although, again, for most of you, this will be grayed out because you're in PC mode. Fine-tune grayed out, you can't use it. White balance, this one you want to make sure you're at somewhere around warm 40 to warm 50. I know a lot of people will think, well, that's going to be too yellow. But if you're looking for accuracy and you're looking to get as close to the D6500 white point as possible, then you're going to want it to be around warm 50. That's the correct setting. If you feel like it's a little bit too yellow for you, then back it down to 40 or 45. Method points, red, green, blue, that's for manual calibration. Just leave them alone. You don't need to worry about that. Then we go down to clarity. The default setting for sharpness is 10. Anything above that, and then you start worrying about introducing artifacts and noise and ringing to your image, which you don't want. A lot of people think, a common thought process would be, well, I improve the sharpness or I increase the sharpness, say up to 20, 30, or 40. It's going to make my image look sharper. But really what it's doing, and a lot of YouTubers have proven this, Vincent, HDTV test, if you really jack up the sharpness, what you're doing is you're just hiding details. Because of all of that edge enhancement, all of that introduced ringing and artifacting, it's going to hide some of those details that you would otherwise see. Especially with high resolution content like this in native 4K, you really don't need too much sharpness. So keep it at 10 or lower. If you want to be 100% correct with your setting, set it to 0. I like just a smidge of edge enhancement, so I set it to 5. All these other options, super resolution, noise reduction, MPEG noise reduction, smooth gradation, cinema screen, those are all grayed out in game optimizer mode and in PC mode. You don't need to worry about any of those settings. Again, if you were to turn them on, just like AI Picture Pro, all these things, you end up adding unnecessary latency to your experience, right? And your game becomes less responsive, it's not as immersive, so you don't want to do any of that. True motion is grayed out and off. You don't want any kind of motion interpolation when you're gaming, ideally. Filmmaker mode, auto start, no, you don't want that. You don't want to risk filmmaker mode engaging when you turn on your PlayStation 5 because in filmmaker mode, the latency is brutal. You don't want that. Reduce blue light, see, you set this on and it increases the yellowish look or the color temperature of your screen, and this is to help with eye fatigue. So if you're not too worried about accuracy and you're gaming a marathon gaming session late at night, this might be worth looking into because really harsh aggressive blue light from your OLED, which OLEDs have a lot of, they can really disrupt your sleeping patterns. They can give you headaches, migraines, things like that. So engaging it's not a bad idea, but just keep in mind it might be straying a little bit too far from the D6500 white point that you're looking for. So I use it off. I don't use it. Okay, now those are the picture settings for me in the LG C1 submenus. Now let's bring up the Game Optimizer mode. Okay, let's go to Game Optimizer. Now, I'm in game genre, doesn't really matter. I just leave it standard, then I adjust from there. Black stabilizer goes from 0 all the way up to 20. The lower the black stabilizer, the darker the blacks on your screen. If you go too low, you could introduce black crush. The higher the black stabilizer, the better the visibility, but the screen gets washed out. So the default setting is 10. That's the most accurate setting. But I'd recommend you play around with it, especially if you're playing a game like Call of Duty or, you know, Halo Infinite like this. You want good visibility for a shooter. You want good reaction times. You want to be able to quickly spot your enemy. So that's why I turn my black stabilizer up just a little bit to 11. That gives me a little bit more visibility in the shadow areas. White stabilizer, same song and dance, 0 all the way up to 20. White stabilizer, in my opinion, has a bigger impact with HDR, but it does also impact the screen with SDR content as well. If you go up to 20, I'll show you right here, you get a little bit more detail in your bright highlights, but you lose some of that visceral impact. So look at the clouds, we go up to 20. You see the cloud detail became a little bit better, the edge of the clouds became more defined. You just get a little bit better visibility in those bright areas. But you lose, again, some of that dynamism and punch. So I like to set it a little bit lower. 10 is the default. That's the accurate, correct setting. As we go down, look at the clouds. See how you kind of lost some detail and they became a little bit fuzzy? You don't really want to go too low because then you risk losing some of that detail. You risk clipping. It's all a matter of taste, really, what you're willing to subject yourself to for that visceral impact. Again, 0 potential clipping, but more brightness and impact. So I tend to go a little bit on the more brightness side. So I set it to like 6 or 7 or 8. Just depends on taste. So I'll leave it at 7 for here. I don't find that there's too much clipping at 7, and you have a little bit more brightness in your highlights for a little bit better impact. OLED Motion Pro is off. Reduce blue light, that is off. Like kind of similar to what we talked about earlier. If you do level 2, it will help your eyes, but at the same time, it will probably make the screen a little bit too yellowish for most people's likings. So I leave it off. You already have warm at 50. Prevent input delay. You want to set this to boost if you are using a 60 FPS game. So most consoles, Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5, they play at 60 Hertz or 60 frames per second. So in that case, you would want to use boost. What the TV does in boost mode is it takes that 60 Hertz signal coming in from your PlayStation 5 or Series X, your source in this instance, and it duplicates it to create a 120 Hertz signal. And by duplicating the frames like that, it lowers the latency a little bit, or the input lag. So natively at 60 Hertz, the LG C1 displays with an input lag of about 13 milliseconds. When you boost that 60 Hertz signal and duplicate it with the boost mode here, it goes down to about 8 or 9 milliseconds. You're gaining about 3 or 4 milliseconds, which is probably not noticeable to most, but it's an improvement, and it's something you really should use. Keep in mind, if you're gaming natively at 120 FPS from a 120 Hertz source like your PC or RTX 3080, then using boost mode won't help you in any way, shape, or form. It only really helps to boost or minimize latency for 60 Hertz signals. So we go back into Game Optimizer mode. We scroll down past boost. We get the game dashboard that's on. AI game sound is on, and I'll show you why in just a moment. VRR and G-Sync. If you have an NVIDIA GPU, an RTX 3000 series card, even 2000 series card, and it's G-Sync compatible, then you would want to turn this on because the LG C1 is also VRR NVIDIA G-Sync compatible. Conversely, if you are using an Xbox Series X or an AMD graphics card in your PC, you would want to turn VRR G-Sync off and AMD FreeSync Premium on to get VRR with your AMD GPU. And then if you feel like you want to tweak the dark areas of your screen just a little bit more to have a little bit more control over the dark areas, visibility, things like that, then you can use fine-tune dark areas. I leave it at 0, which is default. And this is your menu color, which, you know, whatever. You can orange, green, violet. Let's go with orange. It doesn't really matter. So that's going to do it for all of my picture settings. Now really quickly, my sound, and I went over this in my HDR picture settings video, but I'll do it again for those people that missed that. So the LG C1 and the LG C10, it has a 2.2 configuration, which means basically left and right channels. That's all it has. Stereo audio reproduction from your LG C1 speakers and your C10 speakers. So with that in mind, I go sound. I use AI Sound Pro or Game Optimizer for game. I go to advanced settings. I turn Dolby Atmos off because you have a 2.2 configuration with the LG C1. You don't have height channels. You don't have multiple channels within the LG C1 screen. You don't have, it's just going to be synthesized. You can't really recreate Dolby Atmos from 2 channels left and right. So I just turn it off because otherwise it's fake, it's synthesized. You may like it, and if you do, use it by all means, but it's not for me. Balance 0, that's where you should be. Installation type, if you have your TV wall mounted, make sure you select wall mount, otherwise just leave it on stand. Automatic volume adjustment, no, you don't want that at all. You don't want the TV to manipulate your volume. Select HDMI input audio format. Now because, like I said, this LG C1 is left and right channel only, I select PCM. PCM is basically raw, uncompressed 2-channel audio in its native state. And because, like I said repeatedly now, the TV is 2-channel audio, it pairs perfectly, it sounds good to me. If you are using some sort of receiver, you're passing through a receiver and you have a surround sound configuration, make sure you select Bitstream, otherwise you will not get surround sound, okay? So make sure you use Bitstream if you're using Atmos, a surround sound setup, okay? Otherwise, if you're using the TV's native speakers, which is left and right, PCM will be just fine, and that's what I prefer. That's pretty much it. Now, one more quick thing to optimize the sound of your LG C1. Go down to General, go down to AI Service. Go down to AI Acoustic Tuning. Start new tuning. So basically, the remote for the LG C1, dubbed the Magic Remote, it has a microphone in it, right? So you can speak into it, give it commands, you know, search for things on YouTube by telling it, right? But you can also use this remote to calibrate the sound of your LG C1 speakers so that it sounds best in your acoustic environment, right? Now, what I recommend doing is, because your remote is going to pick up on these tuning sounds and make the adjustments based on what it's hearing, I recommend putting your remote at ear level, okay? So like right here. So if you sit here routinely, then you want the audio to sound its best where you're sitting, right? You want your ears to hear the most optimized sound possible. So when you are about to start this tuning, I'd hold the remote right here because this is where I normally sit, and hit start. And that's it. The sound is now tuned for your acoustic environment, and it really does make a little bit of a difference, as you'll see here on the next screen. So this is AI Acoustic Tuning off. Sounds okay, right? Now let's go to AI Acoustic Tuning on in 3, 2, 1. So you see it just sounds a little bit fuller. It sounds maybe a little bit more dynamic, maybe a little bit more warm. So it just sounds a little bit better, and it's worth doing. It only takes up 5 seconds of your time, so why not, right? And then of course you can adjust it a little bit further depending on your preference. So if you want standard, that's what I have, that's fine. If you want to emphasize boost or bass boost, it gets a little bit more low end. If you want to emphasize treble, maybe you can hear gunshots and footsteps a little bit better when you game, so you would emphasize the treble boost. But I'm just going to leave it at standard and apply. Okay. And that's it. We're done. We are done. So those are my picture and audio settings for SDR Gaming on the LG C1. Now let me unplug this real quick, plug in my controller, give you guys a quick taste of what it looks like here. I think it looks great. It's colorful. Visibility is excellent. Latency is low. You have no interpolation on. You have no additional processing on. That's all grayed out or off, which means your input lag is as low as possible. Even in SDR, you've got pretty good impact from your highlights. It looks great. So let me know if you try out these settings, what you ultimately think in the comment section down below. If you have any additional questions or comments, again, leave them down below. And as usual, I will get back to each and every one of you, or at least I will do my best. And until next time, guys, I will see you later. Peace.